Yes, this one's a funny one because obviously we've just had the US release, and then this, but the I'm releasing singles and music videos with the singles, which is really cool. So I'm just about to start work on the third single. The second one's ready to go out on the 12th of February. So that's when that one will go out. And the first one's gone out. It's been a couple of weeks, and the third single will go out sometime towards the end of March. I'm not sure yet. And then the vinyl and digital release of the soundtrack and the film will be coming out in the UK in we're hoping, fingers crossed, mid-April, depending on cinemas. So because it's got to come, this one has to come out in theatrical cinemas in the UK because they don't have the infrastructure to release it virtually, just like Kino Lorber did in the States.
Mm.
So yeah, so interesting. We'll see what happens.
I mean, it has. I don't know. I think you had mentioned this is the first time you've released singles. I mean, was that something on your end, or something that kind of was pushed by the studio, or what?
No, well, I mean, I wanted to. I wasn't really shopping around for a record label, but I knew that I wanted to release the score, and the film company were behind it, of course, as well. And I was really wanting to release this physically on vinyl because of the texture and the aesthetics of the music and the score. I felt that it would lend itself really well to a vinyl pressing. So I contacted Mercury KX, who they're not a soundtrack label, they're a sort of modern neoclassical experimental record label. And I really respect many of the artists on the label. And I just felt that the aesthetic of the music and the style of the music really would really connect with Mercury KX and their listeners. And sure enough, I sent it to them, and literally within 3 days, they got back to me and said, "We love this. We want to release this." So there we go. We just and I said, "What about vinyl?" And they said, "Absolutely." So they're really behind it, and that's been very exciting to work
That's
with
really
them.
cool.
Yeah.
And it's also, you saying that they're not a soundtrack specific label. It's nice seeing, I think, more and more labels getting behind those releases. I mean, I've noticed it seems like even just in the last couple of years, there's been such an explosion in interest in film music and especially film music on vinyl. So it's so great that you're getting more labels interested in it.
Yeah, and also for me personally, this score is actually, people always ask composers, film and TV composers, what's your sound? And because I'm a kind of a chameleon when it comes to different musical styles, it's a very difficult area for film and media composers, screen composers, because we can turn our hands to many different things. And for me, this score is the closest that I've ever got to what my sound is. Combines different aesthetics and the process and the experimental way that we created the score on this. So that's why I wanted to take it to a label that would really connect and have that understanding. This is more of a hybrid between a film score and a personal artist release for me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess, I mean, diving right into the score, one of the things that's most noticeable about it, especially when you're watching the film, is the use of kind of sound design in the score almost. There are quite a few sequences actually where, for instance, there's the humming of a fan and the clicking that it makes that slowly builds and then suddenly it's, well, not even suddenly, you almost don't notice that then it becomes the percussion, or raindrops are falling and it's the same thing, or that kind of like subtle hum of green boxes becomes a heavier drone in the background. And I mean, I thought that was a really interesting choice, and especially when the film itself is so built on these sensory experiences. So, I mean,
Hmm.
was that your plan the whole time?
Yeah, so the director, Jerry Rothwell, he called me up and said, when he wanted me to work on the score and offered me the job, he said, "Do you ever work with found sound?" And I said, "Well, I started off in the industry as a sound designer. And so for me, sound is sound, whether it's music or sound, there's no real difference there. And we wanted to blur and blend between the two and interweave between the sound design and the music on this so that the two were really quite integral, because the way that the non-speaking characters experience the world is a very multi-sensory experience, and for autistic people, all their senses are heightened, and they're very, very sensitive to sound in the environment around them. Hence the decision to try and put the audience inside the mind and the headspace of these characters to make you feel as an audience, as a viewer, some way of trying to make you feel in as authentic way as possible what it's like to be inside their head and to experience the sound as they may possibly experience it. But even then, I mean, it's not terribly authentic. We can't profess to being, accurate, but it's some kind of surrealistic impression of what it might feel like. So that was a really, really interesting challenge. And I was brought on in terms of process. I was brought on really early on. Jerry wanted me to create this cinematic, immersive oral experience to represent the world of Naoki, the original author of
Hmm.
the book, and his writings. Um, yeah, so that was so where the sound design is a more abstract representation of Naoki's writings. The music veers towards representing the emotional state of being, and it gives the characters an internal voice. So but obviously both work hand in hand. So I started off very, very early in the shoot, or even before the edit started, at least, while they were still filming. And I didn't have any visuals to work with at that stage. It was quite a few months before I got any images and pictures. So it was very, very collaborative. I worked very closely with the director and the editor and the sound designer as well. And having come from a sound design background, um, I'm not, it's taught me so much about, how to use sound in a narrative to drive the narrative forward and the storytelling forward through sound and music. So I wasn't precious about my music. If I think the most important thing was to tell the story in the right way through sound, through these amazing sequences that got handed to us. So I wrote a lot of musical ideas and experiments before over 15 months that I was involved in the film, more than a year. And these ideas were based on conversations with the director, uh, based on concepts that we created. So we base these concepts of how to approach the score based on the way that these autistic characters perceive the world around them. So, for example, one of the parameters that we created was autistic people see the detail in objects before they see the whole picture. As neurotypicals, you or I, we might walk into a room and see the room and what's happening, and then focus in on little details like a cup or a vase of flowers on the table, or a little light bulb that's on. But the characters in the film see the details in incredible detail before they see the whole picture unfold around them. And so the way that I structured the music and some of the pieces um, was influenced by that idea. It's like seeing little pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together, and then having the whole picture unfold around you. And another concept from the book was the idea of repetition and oscillations. So you touched upon the table the ceiling fans and the table fans going round and round. And the character Umrit in that scene and in other scenes, she finds circular motions and repetition to be a very cathartic, comforting release for her. So she will sway backwards and forwards in response to, you know, the sound of the fans going round and round. So I took and I was given a lot of found sound elements from the scenes, and I then integrate that into the music by chopping them up and creating rhythms out of them, and in the fan piece, floating into focus, that particular piece on the soundtrack, I took these found sound elements and created rhythms out of them and created polyrhythms, and then out of that grows a piece of music that overwhelms you by the end, and that's hopefully sort of cathartic. Um, and the other one of the other major aspects of the score and the film is the fact that these characters are non-verbal, they're non-speaking. So we thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to give them some kind of use the human voice? You know, it's quite a sort of an obvious thing. You know, I want to give the characters and, you know, for the voice to represent their internal voice. And so I took key phrases from the book, and that was in English, and translated it back into the original Japanese version of the book, and took some key phrases like, for example, we are outside the flow of time, or beautiful circle, you know, these sort of really important phrases that have a lot of meaning to them. And I broke them down into smaller elements and recorded the broken up phrases of consonants, vowels, and syllables, deconstructed them, and then reconstructed them with various treatments and layers using my own voice. And that was it was like I sung them in a very abstract, fractured way to mirror the internal world of the characters. So that was a lot of fun. And also with the vocals, two of the characters in the film, they use this letterboarding technique. They have this sort of keyboard, and when they press on the keys, it actually, the voice will say ya ita osaka, and it pieces them together and that's how they communicate with the world, because these letters then form words. And so when you see those scenes in the film, and you see the letters coming up on the screen as graphics, I actually integrated the my voice singing those consonants and vowels, which are being pieced together as it unfolds on the screen in front of you. So that was a sort of like I was going to say subtle, but it wasn't really that subtle. It was quite direct, but hopefully an interesting way to get across how they were communicating.
Interesting. I mean, that is, it's funny because, at the very end you're mentioning the subtlety versus, non-subtlety of it all. But I think there are so many pieces in there. It's so easy to, watch or listen and, in some ways to at least not consciously notice. I think a lot of it works on a subconscious level as well. Especially like the oscillation, having something that's cathartic or comforting. Part of the effect of catharsis or comfort is almost an unknowing element of it. You're not sitting there comfortable and thinking, wow, like this is so comfortable. It's just working kind of subconsciously. And so you putting it into words like that, really then you think about it and go, oh yeah, all of that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, yes, yeah. I mean, repetition is a very, well, I mean, obviously it's very heightened for autistic people, neurodivergent people, but even just as neurotypical like me, I don't really think about it or analyze it so much. But we like familiarity, and we like the people generally like the comfort of routine in our daily lives. We work a lot of people work 9 to 5, and we have meals at set times, and we go on holidays at set times in the summer and the winter, and everything from our daily lives to our the whole picture of our lives and what we expect, and like our biological clock, or our our biorhythms, we're all geared towards regularity and routine. I'll wake up, or even animals like cats and dogs, they'll wake up at a set time every morning, and it's this inner clock in them that knows. And so, if you think about it, actually, it makes perfect sense for us to feel, if my our routines are broken up, it can be slightly disorientating when we go on a long flight and we suffer from jet lag because our body's not used to it. So it's I guess it's a much more explicit way for the characters in the film to feel comfort in this repetition. But we all live by routines and regularity in our lives. So it's quite interesting, actually. And so one of the challenges was to, in the music, and the soundscape, was to bring out how to translate these ideas into music, and that was a lot of fun. One idea that didn't work was, because the original author was this 13-year-old Japanese boy. We thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to have some Japanese influences to the music? And after a couple of weeks of trying different things, we just thought, no, this isn't going to work, because it was just too on the nose. It was really cheesy, and also the subject is quite universal. It's we just and the other thing was, the character was no longer in the film. He didn't Naoki, the original author, didn't want to then be in the film, so we scrapped it and went for a different approach. So yeah, that's yeah, it's quite interesting. Another thing was instruments, having a unique sound palette. So there are 5 or 6 characters, and we thought about using a different instrument for each character. So there's one girl, Justina, she's from Africa, and she plays with these magical little beads on her wrist, and that they're magical to her. She's fascinated by them, and they glisten and they glow. And so I have this instrument called a halo. It's basically like a hand pan, and it sounds like a tuned percussive instrument, and it's got this softness of touch to it. It's a beautiful sound, and it sounds as though it could come from Africa, but it isn't. It's quite an earthy sound. So that became her instrument and her sound. And I used cellos and violins a lot, um, and recorded them in a very experimental way. So the recording process was really experimental and different to how I normally work. And with Ben and Emma, they have this great friendship, this couple, and so we thought it ended up being. I used the acoustic double bass became her instrument, and the acoustic guitar was Ben's sound. So you hear that in a couple of cues in the film as well. So yeah, that was the sound palette, and trying to separate them all was quite an interesting journey there. And I also brought in woodwind, the saxophone and the clarinet, which is used really subtly. It's quite subtle in the film. You hear it in the opening piece, and because of this circular idea and motion, I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to have this breathing in and out, just regular breathing. And I thought of having the saxophone, and the woodwind and the clarinet to get that across and use it in a very breathy way. So we've got this. I brought in this great saxophonist, Ben Vince, who's quite experimental and a bit like Colin Stetson in that sort of double, that circular breathing techniques that they use. We try to integrate a bit of that in the film as well.
Interesting, and yeah, you can hear some of those lines carrying through the different sequences for the characters. If you haven't seen it, the documentary is kind of broken up into showing almost not quite vignettes, but it'll focus on one of these particular characters for 10, 15 minutes and then move on. So it allows for that particular palette, but at the same time, it's not so overt either, where it's, here is this very distinct theme for Joss, here's this very distinct theme for Justina. Like you said, there are the instruments that represent each one, but there's still the kind of the universality between them all, where at the end of the day, it is a common palette for the most part in that use of sound design. So it's an interesting balance between keeping it unique but also keeping a common thread throughout.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. You're right. Having this core palette, and then we could branch off into different directions to illustrate different things. Yeah.
And so one thing that I was thinking as well, both in the opening moments of the film, but also talking about the oscillation, the comfort, is the the opening sequence is this dark night on a rocky shoreside, and the music is actually quite intense, and it did kind of mirror my experience of watching the first few minutes of the film, where I didn't really know what the tone was going to be, and it is a little, I mean, it is a little uncomfortable, especially if you're someone who's neurotypical and doesn't have experience like that. It's something that's just so different for you that kind of sets you off guard. But then, you know, once you become kind of used to the film, and that music really guides you through. So, I mean, was that a conscious effort, or what?
Oh, it was a long process of trial and error. We didn't really, I mean, we had all these ideas that I've explained to you about,
Hmm.
the perception of time is different, looking at the detail in objects and circular motions, using the human voice. And we had all these concepts and ideas that evolved over the months. And, but we didn't really know how the film was going to pan out. And, even the idea, we thought at first we might interweave between all the characters, and then ultimately, after many months of editing, we'd ended up uh, putting them into their little blocks, as you picked up on. We focus on one character for 15, 20 minutes, and then we move on to the next and the next. And it was seemed to be the most elegant way of making the flow of the film, and getting the story across. And that opening scene, I think, is one of my most favorite cues, because it's got all it was in fact, actually, it was the first piece of music that I wrote after speaking to the director. I thought, I've got to have a theme for the film, and it quite often doesn't work out that way. You'll write lots I tend to write lots of music, and then towards the end of a project is when will think, oh well, there's a really great piece, let's use that for the opening, once you've lived with the music for a while. And so it was one of the first big pieces, the themes that I wrote, and it just ended up being the very first piece, and that I then kept tweaking and going back to, and working on it. And it covers, it encapsulates all these different elements. So it's got the vocals in a subtle way, that you hear repeated. You've got the sound of um, the lighthouse that you see on the rocky sea shore, with the lights going round and round. And I use this element of sound design to echo that visually on screen. And what else do we have? I'm just playing the piece of music in my head. Um, and we use the cello, which is quite a warm sound for the boy on screen as he's walking by the shore. And it's got so many. We've got the rhythms, we've got the string elements. There's a and of course, when the title card comes up on screen, you hear the vocals actually singing in syllables. The reason I jump, I actually say the letters ta ha ra sa n ja. ma, ma, pa. But I say it sing it in a fractured way. And the reason I jump and layered it a lot and put lots of delays and echoes so that because when we hear the human voice, the director didn't want me to treat the vocals so much that they sounded electronic, and that happened a few times. Like sometimes I'd treat it and I'd push it a bit too much, and it sounded like a synthesizer and very robotic. I said, no, 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 we've got to strip it back, tone it down, and really have a fine balance between so that it still sounds like as though it's produced by a human voice, but it doesn't sound as though it's a normal voice. Like, we wanted it to be more dreamlike and unintelligible. So, and the other thing with the whole score is that all the music in there is created, all the sounds are either acoustic or produced from an organic sound source. There are no synths in the score at all. There's nothing that's electronically created. So that there's one scene, another thing you picked up on the raindrops. So there's one scene where you see the book, The Reason I Jump, on the table, and it's open on a page, and I have a rhythm going on, and there's a little percussive rhythm that sounds like hi-hats, and there's also this circular thing is actually my voice made to sound like where I'm breathing really rapidly in rhythm, in time with the music. And I created this sort of hi-hat sound with the breathing, and I took the sound of a raindrop, a few raindrops, and made them into a rhythm, a percussive rhythm. And then with the sound designer, he then puts real raindrops as you see them falling on the book. It's raining on the book, and you hear the sound of those real raindrops so that the two are kind of blended together. So sometimes, a lot of what you're listening to you think is just pure sound design, but it's actually stuff that's created by me, and it's sort of blurring the lines between the two a lot. So that was so much fun, and just very experimental, and then we had a lot of fun in the mix as well, which was some cues were actually constructed in the mix. Because one thing we did was, I don't know how nerdy you want me to get, but geeky, but
go as nerdy or geeky as you want to get.
there's one scene in the film set in a forest, and it's the darkest, probably the darkest scene in the film, where they're talking about the horrible experiments that were created in the Second World War on disabled people, and sort of World War II and the Nazis and all that. And so this boy, this representation of Naoki, this fictional character, he's in the film, he's walking through the forest, and you hear this recordings of these audio voiceover or radio broadcasts about the experiments that were going on. And so I created this piece of music using just cellos, and it was a proper piece of music when I delivered it to the mix, but I also deliver stems, sort of all the individual elements. So when we were in the mix, we just felt that the piece of music wasn't working, and what we did was we took the impulse response from the forest. So when they were filming on location, they recorded the actual ambience, the impulse response of the space of the forest or of all the different locations. And we put the musical piece, the sound of the cellos, inside the ambience of the forest. So it feels as though the instrument is actually inside the forest playing. And we did that a few other times where you're in the art exhibition and you hear the piano playing Umrit's theme, which is, this beautiful piece of music that is meant to represent the beauty of her artwork. And we put the piano in the space of the art gallery. So I didn't use my normal reverbs. I gave a dry, pure sound of the piano playing, and then we put it inside the sound space of the art gallery. And so it's a very, very that was another way of making it much more immersive, and where you're inside the space and inside the film. So that was a lot of fun, and we that forest scene, we really separated everything out and stripped things right back, and really almost constructed a new piece of music out of the cello lines that I had delivered. So the piece on the soundtrack is quite different, a different mix to the piece in the film itself.
Hmm, interesting. And so, as far as the different piece between film and soundtrack, I mean, what is your I guess what is your approach to creating a standalone musical release then?
It's a good question, Nick. I mean, a lot of, I wrote a lot of music that didn't end up in the film because I was writing ideas and sketches and themes, and I held these very sort of improvisational, experimental recording sessions with various musicians. So, and that's another story in itself. But with the soundtrack, I wrote these themes and pieces, and when I delivered them to the edit, and we'd go backwards and forwards with music, things would change a lot. And when we got to the final mix, and we were mixing in Dolby Atmos and in 360 sound, even then again the pieces would change in the final mix. So because it had to work with the storytelling and it had to work with the sound design and so on. So when it came to working out the soundtrack release, I went back to my original mixes and the cues that I delivered to them. And, it's a very different experience. I wanted it to work as a standalone experience where you could just listen to the music, and it would flow as one and take you on a musical journey as opposed to the musical journey of the film. But I mean, even with the track titles, they're very representative of these aspects of autism that are explained in the film. So, so yeah, that was another journey in itself that I wanted to get right, and so yeah, and that, and, again, another reason for releasing it on vinyl, where in this day of streaming, you just listen to one piece, your favorite piece, and then you'll listen to another piece from another artist and another, and it was really important to me to have this experiential journey through the score as much as you do having it through the film as well.
Interesting. And you'd mentioned earlier about the vinyl release and just now again. What is it that you find about vinyl as opposed to the other physical media that lends itself so well, or that will lend itself so well to this piece of music in particular?
Um, well, I think the way that I recorded the actual tone of the score, the aesthetic of the score is that I didn't want it to be incredibly pure or clean in terms of the recordings and the sounds. The way I recorded the cellos and the violins and the strings and the other instruments is that there's a roughness and there's a rawness to it.
Mm.
And so even that, where you hear the sound of the bow hitting the strings, or even with the human voice, with my singing voice, I didn't want it to be so perfect. I wanted it to have a very organic, um, slightly homemade sound. But that doesn't mean that it was recorded badly. It was recorded very, I had the best microphones and preamps, and in my recording studio, and everything's in tune and in time. but there, I didn't want to suck the energy out of the performances by making it all pristine and clear. Like, for example, there are some cues with vocals on where I kept some of the breaths in
Hmm.
my vocals, and you can almost hear the lip smacking. I edited it out at one point, and I just thought it's lost all its character, and so I put put some of those breaths back in. I kept it like that. And so releasing it on vinyl again is more like this. I love this touchy feely thing about vinyl, is that once you put the soundtrack on, you're not going to skip like you would with an MP3. You're not going to skip to another track. You're just going to, it forces you to listen to A side and then flip it over and have the B side. And the way I order the tracks is very, I just want to take the listener on this journey really through the score.
Interesting. I mean, and I find that the preferable way to listen, particularly to film music, that it's generally designed to create an experience, either one that kind of mimics the film itself if it's released in effectively a chronological order, or one that is kind of adjacent to the film if it's moved slightly or has different tracks like yours. And while people may love certain cues and want to listen to them over and over, and there's obviously nothing wrong with that, it does certainly suck out a lot of the impact of the piece in its entirety. And so
Yeah.
obviously I appreciate that. Um, you know, one day I'll get a record player and actually be able to play some of these, but until then I'm stuck listening to the full pieces digitally.
Yeah, I've just received the test pressing of the vinyl. I'm really excited about that. I've got to listen to it to make sure, just to experience it. It's been a while since I tend not to listen to my own music very much after I've finished a project. So I've got to listen to it after this chat with you. So it's going to be interesting to see, do I go on that same journey that I want other people to? So I can't wait for that. Yeah.
Sounds fun.
Mm,
And
mm.
I do like the idea of it not being, very overproduced, pristine, perfect. And I know that is obviously a trend with kind of certain types of music, and a lot of popular music in general. And it has its place, but I think you're spot on that the score for The Reason I Jump is not the place for that. So
Yeah.
that choice makes perfect sense to me. Um,
Yeah.
I
But the
did want
funny
to.
thing is,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, sorry. But conversely, I actually spent 15 months working on it, and I was in control of every single little detail. So it's hyper produced in terms of editorially, in that, I spent a long time on each piece, but I wanted to balance that out with keeping it a little bit slightly rough around the edges,
Right.
in a good way.
Right. Yeah. You didn't record it in 20 minutes and say, all right, I'm done. Um,
No,
but
no.
yeah. I did want to ask about your working relationship with the sound designer. I mean, that is something that in different contexts I've had composers talk about where, you know, often they want to avoid having similar tones or pitches so that they don't, clash with one another or blend together and kind of reduce the impact of both at once. But this, like we've mentioned before, is a much different um, piece of music and kind of piece of sound design. So I mean, how did you and the designer work together to create this end result?
Yeah, I mean, we discussed that a lot. How are we going to do this? And ultimately, I think what we decided to do in certain key scenes, we would collaborate more, and in other scenes, we would do our own thing and then come together at the end. So we'd have these discussions. We'll take a scene like, for example, early on in the film, you see the big rhythmical um, ceiling fan and table fan piece that introduces you to the character of Umrid. So it's very rhythmical, heavy on the polyrhythms. So I got given sound design elements of found sound there, and I created my own version of the piece where I did my own rhythms, and then I added other musical elements to it, and delivered that in various stems and different layers of rhythms and so on for them to then work with. Conversely, the sound designer did his thing as well. So obviously he wasn't his work wasn't tonal because he was staying out of that space, but he would create his own rhythms out of those sounds. And so when we got to the mix, when we were doing rough mixes before we got to the final theatre, dubbing theatre, we would then take the best, we would do a mix and match of what we thought would work of mine and what was working from his. And then when we got to the mix, we would then pick the best elements and fuse them together, and mix them together. So that was one way that we did it. And with the green box choir, with this 50-piece choir that I recorded, which was myself recorded 50 times in my studio. We started off with the hum of these electrical generators, and which the character Joss can hear. And to Joss, it sounds like the hum of this electricity sounds like a choir of angels. And that was one of the key phrases in the book that we started off with that. We thought, wouldn't it be great to create something that sounds off starting like electricity hums and then grows into a choir. So I recorded my own voice and layered it sort of in 40, 50 times, pitch shifted it down so that I'd sound like a baritone or bass, tenor voice. I changed the formants in the voice. I used granular synthesis a lot in the human treatments of the voice to play around, which is basically chopping up all the sound elements into tiny little fractions and then looping them together, which is what granular synthesis is in a very simplistic way. And and so I then give that all in various stems to the sound designer, and we will then go backwards and forwards, working out the best way of sort of piecing it together. Sometimes, the sound did the job, and I'd strip away some of the music. So in the film, that's why you're getting different mixes to what you're getting on the soundtrack. So yeah, it was quite collaborative and quite experimental, but there was no set way of doing anything. With Nick, the sound designer.
Yeah, and go ahead.
That green box piece. When we got to the theatre, that we had an amazing time mixing that in surround in 360 sound, because we were taking elements and spinning them around the top, and we were increasing the width and the height of the mix in 360. But the documentary aspects of the score were very normal in stereo, and then for the stylized sequences, that's where we really sort of increased the width and the height, and we played around, because everything that we did with the immersive sound mix had to have a reason. We didn't want to use it as a gimmick. This is not a sci-fi film where you can have spaceships flying around and all around you. We wanted it to have a reason for doing everything that we did with the immersive mixing. So it had to be a part of the storytelling.
Interesting. And I guess that actually segues sort of into what I was going to ask later on. And that relates to the the storytelling differences between a scripted or feature film or TV series versus a documentary. I think there are a lot of differences in how you have to approach the two. In a film, you can get the script first, start working off of it, and even though the final film is almost certainly going to be somewhat different, it's not going to be a completely different creation than what you've first seen. Whereas, especially talking about The Reason I Jump, you're starting with these abstract concepts, and maybe there's a rough idea of how it will turn out, but you don't have a real documentary isn't going to have a script. And so what are the different challenges that you face working on scoring a film versus on a documentary film?
Actually, when you're working on feature documentaries, they're not that different from working on narrative fiction features at all. And I sort of oscillating between the two. I've got a film, got to work on a feature film soon, and I'll be brought in quite early on feature docs and on feature films. So I work very organically with the director and the editor, and we're going backwards and forwards with ideas. And on a feature, and actually with the feature doc as well, after we've picture locked, I'll have a few weeks to work on the score as well. Sometimes it all depends on when you're brought in. If
Right.
I'm brought in late in the day, then it's like you're going to default mode, and it's a kick, bollock, and scramble to try and get all the music written as fast as possible. But I think the differences come with TV. On TV
Mm,
documentaries, you can quite, um, it's very pressured, and you're having to work very fast, and you don't get to work from a script. But on feature docs, I do get given treatments, and I have a lot of discussions and with the director about tone. I'll create musical mood boards, so that we'll share playlists of music that's inspiring us, and we'll talk about the tone of the series or the show. So we do have those creative discussions, but obviously with a film, you have a film script, and so you sometimes I don't work from a script. Sometimes if I'm being considered for a project, I'll be sent a script to read, and I think, well, I'm doing at the moment. I'm reading a script, and I've been offered a feature, and so coming up with I'll have in my mind ideas about the tone of the score just by reading the script. But I'm actually a very visually inspired composer. So I love, it informs me in a different way when I get visuals thrown at me, as opposed to just abstract ideas or working from a script. So that's interesting. And even when you have characters in a feature film or in a script, you're working, you can write themes for characters, but you can still do that. I still do that in documentaries, especially with the streamers like Netflix and Amazon and HBO. They're they're putting so much time and allowing so much time into the craft of documentaries, high-end documentaries these days, that I have as much time, if not more time, on documentaries than I do on features or drama series. On a drama, you're lucky if you get a week to 2 weeks per episode sometimes, whereas on a documentary, I can be working on an episode for 5, 6, 7 weeks, or a one-off 1 hour show. I might get 10 or 11 weeks to score a doc. So in terms of time, that's not a problem. I think budgets are a different, is a different thing altogether. You can have more luxurious budgets to work with, getting in live musicians. But even on the feature docs I've done recently, like American Murder for Netflix, I brought in the London Contemporary Orchestra, and I recorded them during lockdown last year. So that was fun. and and obviously on The Reason I Jump, I got to bring in various musicians through the whole process. So I treat the two in a similar way when I'm working with on docs or with video games. That's a very different thing altogether.
interesting.
I'm working on a couple of video games at the moment, and I'll be working on them for a very long period of time. So that's a different experience, and a different process. You're much more involved with the narrative team and the programming team and the artwork, and you're right across all the different aspects of the game, and things will be written and created. It's evolving, in a similar way to how a film is made, but we're still delving into the unknown. So things change a lot with video games. So I'm at in diving into that process where we're trying to figure out the tone of the music as the game evolves as well. So that can be fun.
Interesting. And that's if we had more time, I'd love to dive into that because frankly, I know absolutely nothing about video game music, and I haven't talked with anyone about it. And I used to play quite a lot of video games when I was younger, but don't anymore. So it's just such an unknown to me, and like I'd love to hear about it, but unfortunately, we don't have unlimited time.
Another time. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, I guess we're getting close to an hour at this point, which is, usually how long I like these to go. But I did want to
Mhm.
ask, you know, getting into film and other media composition, you're, you know, generally not doing it for accolades and to become filthy rich or anything. But for you, you've been doing this for a while, and recently you had last year for Sama, 2020. You know, you had quite a lot of critical recognition for your score, and then The Reason I Jump has recently picked up a Cinema Eye award and a BIFA nomination. I think it might have been a Cinema Eye nomination. I don't remember. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I mean, how has you know is is that sort of a critical and award recognition something that you particularly care about? Is it just nice to hear, but you go on your way? I mean, what is your response to that?
I mean, when you're working on something, I'm not thinking, oh, I want to win an award with this score when
Yeah.
I'm writing it, because it's just, the most important thing is just getting through the job. It's so, it can be quite stressful and you're up against, there's so many different factors you're thinking about. So, I just want to get through the project and do the best work that I can. And that ultimately the work and the creativity and working in a harmonious way with the team is the most is the primary thing that all you care about. And then I think it's like a bonus, it's an extra when you are recognized. It just tells me that people have connected with your work, and that's really special as well. I remember going to Cannes Film Festival with Forsama, sitting in the theatre in the cinema for the first time, seeing the film up on the big screen. And I looked around me, and when you're working on something for a long period of time, whether it's weeks or months or even years on a project, you sort of lose that perspective because you're just working with your team, your small team, and you don't know whether what you're doing is going to work or not, or resonate with people emotionally. And so when I sat there in the cinema and I saw these grown men were crying around me, I thought, oh wow, what's happening here? Because I'm so close to the film, I can't see it with fresh eyes anymore. And I actually saw it through their eyes and ears, and I thought, oh, this is really connecting with people, and that's just the most amazing feeling. And I think that to me is the reward when you see your work on screen, whether it's a laptop screen or in the cinema, which is the best way.
Hmm.
You're reaching, the ability to reach a wide an audience as possible is truly wonderful. And to see people, whether they love it or they hate it, you can work on something controversial and it be you have a very divided audience. I think that's the most rewarding thing for me. So, I mean, of course, I'm not going to lie and say awards are great, but there's so much wonderful work out there that you can't possibly live, have your career based around, well, I didn't get a BAFTA for that or an Oscar nomination, because there's such amazing work. And also awards, was that phrase I heard recently, awards don't mean anything until you've won one. And then suddenly you win one and go, oh, this is amazing. But it's not why I do it. And I mean, it's nice to be acknowledged, and so I love it. It's great to have these nominations, but there is so much work out there from many composers that I really admire, and projects that I admire, that I think, oh well, they didn't get nominated. That's a real shame. But there's so much great work out there. So it's just the nature of the industry, I guess, um, to pat each other on the back.
And yeah, that is, as someone who enjoys film and media music broadly, you know I do feel very spoiled because there is you're spot on. There's just so much great music out there, and it's both great for me and people like me, but I mean, also the films, the documentaries, the TV series, the games, that in so many ways that, this is kind of a golden age for that music because there are so many great talented people doing it. So it's, you know we all couldn't be luckier to have it.
Yeah, yeah. I think more now than ever before. I think the landscape is very broad and wide ranging, and but also where there's this there's no set way of doing anything anymore. That there's so much more room for experimentation and execs and broadcasters and commissioners and the filmmakers, they're much more open-minded to being bold and having, because there's so much content out there now. We've got there's so much noise in terms of Netflix and the streamers and Hulu and HBO and all these guys, and then the normal, the BBC and the Discovery, Nat Geo, so many channels that they have to try and find a way of standing out. And one of the ways they programs and shows can and films can stand out is by having a really distinctive, bold score. And it really helps enhance the tone and uniqueness of the show by having, let's have something really unusual that we've never heard before and find new ways of telling stories through music. So that, I think, is one of the really one. It's a great time to be a composer in this moment in time, I think, than in previous decades. It's not just the orchestral symphonic score.
Hmm.
Yes, there's a place for that, but because of technology as well and what it enables us to do, we can do so much more now that is more challenging. We're challenging audiences' perspectives of the sonic worlds that we can be immersed in.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, note of hopefulness and positivity, let's stop there. So,
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for.
well, and thanks for joining me. It was so nice. It was such a good documentary watch, such a great score to listen to, and so I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about it.
Thank you very much. It's been great to chat with you today.